Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's OneOp webinar. I am Kaylin Goebel, and I am a Program Development Specialist for OneOp. I will be assisting and moderating today's session on public health approaches to suicide prevention, working with military spouses and military families. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief tour of our webinar platform so you can find your way around. Hopefully you are currently able to view the slides that we're currently sharing. If you can't see them or are having any other difficulties on the Zoom platform or on YouTube, please email us at contact@oneop.org for tech support. We hope you join us in engaging in today's chat pod. To embed the chat so you don't miss any links or conversations, please place your cursor over the shared slides. You should then see a toolbar pop up across the bottom of your screen. From there, just click the chat bubble icon. When typing and submitting your responses and comments, please select everyone from the drop-down menu before hitting the enter and submitting your comments so that everyone in attendance today can view your contributions in the chat pod. Slides and resources are available for download on the webinar event page, and I will be covering continuing education information at the end of today's session. So please stay tuned till the conclusion of today's webinar if you would like instructions on how to obtain CE credits or wish to receive a certificate. And finally, closed captioning is available for this webinar. You can turn subtitles on via the bottom of the Zoom toolbar as well. We thank you for joining us as we continue our partnership with the Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to expand the readiness, knowledge, and networks of professionals supporting our military service members and their families. If at any point today you need to step away from this session or take a moment, a recording of this session and this presentation will be available on the webinar event page for on-demand viewing. That typically takes about 24 hours to post after the webinar. But again, if you need to step away for any reason at all, that will be available to you probably tomorrow. So just visit the event page if you would like to either watch the recording or share that with any colleagues or anyone that may be interested in the session. For today's session, we are very glad to be joined again by Dr. Keita Franklin. Dr. Franklin is joining us for this second session on suicide prevention work within military families. Dr. Franklin, excuse me, Dr. Franklin, goodness, give me one moment. Apologies, I'm having a technical difficulty. Before I hand things over, I would like to give you a quick bio for Dr. Franklin. Dr. Franklin is an accomplished senior executive widely credited with revolutionizing several large-scale national public health systems through her work and expertise focusing on key wellness areas, including suicide prevention, the importance of mental health, and substance abuse. Dr. Franklin has spent her 25-year career driving complex organizational and policy change at both the federal sectors as well as recently transitioning to the private sector. She has served as a senior executive in both the Department of Defense and Department of Veteran Affairs, where she was a principal advisor on all matters related to suicide prevention and support. As a national leader in suicide prevention, Dr. Franklin was responsible for leading a multidisciplined team of experts in the advancement of evidence-based prevention practices for over 3 million active duty members, as well as 20 million military veterans and their families. Dr. Franklin currently serves as within her mental health work within the Deloitte government and public health sector, where she is engaged across all federal health accounts, as well as serves as co-director of the Columbia Lighthouse Project. She also serves on numerous boards and is an advocate for military communities. Again, please note that slides will be available on the webinar event page, and I will be covering continuing education credits at the end of today's session. Dr. Franklin will hopefully also be answering some questions at the end of this session, so please make sure to pop those in the chat pod if you have any throughout the webinar. And with that, I'm happy to hand things over to Dr. Franklin to begin today's session.
Thank you so much, Kaylin, and to the whole OneOp group for such a professional way that you run these webinars. I'm thrilled to be back for my second one and to be talking today about public health approaches for suicide prevention specific to military spouses and children, really a focus on the families. And I know that we did it felt like a week ago, but maybe it was closer to 10 days, 2 weeks ago. We did a similar presentation focused on suicide prevention and public health approaches to working with service members. And so some of this content may feel a little bit familiar, but also there's additional content. If anybody was at that first webinar, can you please even put it in the chat? So I'll kind of get a feel for how many people were at the other one. Oh, and I appreciate also Jason for sharing the link in the chat too. So that's terrific. Okay, we'll make sure that this content builds on that content, and in places where it does feel duplicative, we'll make sure that it's in a good, purposeful way so that we can apply that knowledge to spouses and children. So that being said, we'll jump right in. Here we go. I already talked about this previous seminar, so please take a look at that one if you haven't. It is specific to service members. We'll go ahead with the next slide. Let me see here. I'm doing it myself. I'm sorry. I want to make sure folks know our learning objectives today. So as we spend about an hour and a half together, and that includes questions and all of our time together, hoping that you walk away with these three things. A zeroed in understanding around military connected families and communities. And what was so nice about the last webinar too is people were actually able to put things in the chat, and we were able to learn from each other. So please continue to do that this time, because I greatly appreciated it too, and left the webinar with a number of my own gold nuggets too. We'll also talk about the risk and protective factors specific to spouses, partners, children, all of that. So you should leave with that. And as well, we'll discuss some like tactical level evidence-based strategies that fall in the what to do about it bucket, particularly around spouses that have been impacted around trauma. So we do have a pre-webinar check-in, and this is a poll that we'll go ahead and ask folks to answer. I understand and can explain how military-specific culture and stressors exacerbate mental health issues. I know folks can read, so I'll be quiet for a moment. Appreciate folks putting it in the chat too. So there is a good level of understanding, it looks like. Good, good, good. Oh, and here are our answers, which I always like to kind of take a look at. So there's maybe some new people to the webinar, maybe new to these positions across the DoD that are still kind of trying to figure out a little bit more about the culture and how that plays into the risk and protective factors, because it is its own culture, it is its own subpopulation. And then there's some folks that strongly agree. So we have a little bit of a full continuum here, and I think that's good because we'll be able to learn more from each other. So this is terrific. Just by way of also getting us started, we have one other short answer response about why did you prioritize attending this webinar? Folks can put that in the chat too. It's always good to understand what brings people here today. As I know your schedules are really busy, particularly when you're at the local installations and you're doing direct client care. It is hard to stop and focus on continuing education. So I would love to hear more about why people are doing that. Know that it's also helps prevent burnout when you do stuff like this. So it's good that you're doing it and doing a little bit of self-care. Oh, good. I appreciate that. Somebody, Kim, saying she liked the first one too. And I saw some folks dialing in from some of the Marine Corps bases that I know so well from my time with the Marine Corps. So I also felt so fondly when I saw somebody was dialing in from North Carolina and all these places that I've been so many times. This is terrific. Yeah, we'll continue to populate some of these answers and try to kind of circle back on kind of what brought us here today and what our North Star is when we think about how we prioritize our work. So we'll go ahead and get started too. I want to make sure folks understand, the title of our talk today was really about public health approaches. I know many of you that have dialed into the call today are clinicians. I myself am a social worker by training. I wear that proudly. I love the field of social work and the helping professions writ large. But when we're getting after suicide, we are executing sort of what's known as a public health approach. And for me, early on in my career, it was a little bit difficult to explain. Like, what does it mean when we say we're taking a public health approach? Um, and even during the last seminar, I thought, you know what, it'd be nice just to list them all out so people have a visual on like what is a public health approach. So I want to take a few minutes on this slide just so people understand. Because clinical practice and direct care, whether it's in family advocacy in the SAPR program as an MFLAC or across the board, that's one part of public health. It's an important part and it's rooted in science as is many parts of the public health approach. But that alone doesn't do it. Like it's, how does that saying go? It's necessary, but not sufficient on its own. So our clinical work and our community-based or non-clinical counseling across the board. So there are a number of other elements. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. So there's 16 other sort of things when we think about public health approach. And I want to hit on a couple. And if there's any that I don't hit on that you want me to, like, please definitely put that in the chat. So when we think about doing a comprehensive public health approach, it means that we are disseminating training and evaluation of evidence-based practices. So we're doing a training on one today, but even locally, we make sure that all of our folks that are doing this work are trained on things like CBT, that they're trained on problem-solving therapy, that they're trained on short-term solution focus, that they know how to execute that type of work in a way that's mostly tied to the evidence. And you see right below that public health approaches also involve MOUs and partnering. And we know what that looks like at the local level. This is when family advocacy partners with CPS or partners with, a local moms group to help run, mommy and me groups at the local Y, or brings in public-private sector as a healthy community with permeable walls throughout, not like, oh, this is a base thing and we only do base things and we only interact with people on this base. Like that would not necessarily be, a good approach. But you can look and you see that there's a focus on mental health literacy. This is about teaching people that it's okay if you're not okay. So good public health approaches have campaigns that educate people about hopelessness and helplessness, or educate people about what it means to live a healthy life or work-life balance and all of those things. Good public health approaches also have call centers. I'm hoping everybody on this call is familiar with 988. As the national 3-digit number for suicide, and press 1 if you're a service member or a veteran. I would probably say press 1 as well if you're a family member, because it means that the people that answer those calls are trained in military cultural competence. So you'll get like a fast track kind of approach in making sure you're getting the best care on the call center. But Military One Source falls in that bucket, and just really any other kind of call centers, it's part of the equation. We'll talk today about screening protocols. That's part of the equation. Offering technical assistance, offering good postvention. I'm happy to talk to you more about data, but look at all of these things: policy, gatekeeper training, focusing on lethal means, firearms, medication, all things that can be dangerous if they're in the home, and making sure you have a strategy on how to handle that. But when you're doing all 16 of these things together, full force, like pedal to the metal, like you are just getting after all of them. And by the way, evaluating them, like, how effective is this policy? Am I doing good peer support? Do I have a place on my base for moms to meet moms, peer support mom to mom, or dad to dad, or service member to service member? Do I have good peer support programming going on? It takes all of these things. And you saw this play out on the national stage, I think, in many ways, when we first rolled out with COVID. You saw a national data and surveillance where, like, every day they, posted on the news how many people got diagnosed with COVID, how many people had pre-existing conditions. You saw that they were screening at airports. You saw that there was support for families that were doing caretaking for someone who had COVID. They were training on best practices in the medical community for people with COVID. There was testing and interventions going on. Some communities stood up call centers. That was like an example of public health in action. Same thing for other public health problems like suicide and even child abuse and domestic violence and sexual assault as well. You can sort of see how all of that plays out. So I wanted to tell you about public health just to set the stage for the rest of the talk so that you could sort of think through, what area of the public health continuum do I contribute most? Like, where do I lead? And then maybe where do I follow and rely on others? I don't work the call line. I'll never work the call line, but I'll tell clients about the crisis line. I'm not responsible for collecting the data on my base, but I contribute by letting people know how many met criteria cases there are in child abuse so they can look at that holistically at the garrison level or whatever. Like, you might not do all the parts, but you contribute and all the parts are important. And I also want you to know, you're not singularly responsible for all of this. Like, it takes a village, it takes a community to get after these things. So military families, I was sharing with Caitlin as we were prepping for this call today, like, you all are doing work with military families every day and you know this stuff inside and out. So I know that in many cases, this is a reminder. I'm going to pull up the chat too, so I can see, like, please chime in here, whether some of this resonates with you and, or even if it doesn't, so that we can talk through it, because it is a unique and distinct culture. And we should just be humbled by all that we may not know about military families. I did grow up on military bases myself. My father was an enlisted sailor my whole life until I was 22. And he went to sea a lot long before 9/11 and was gone a lot. We had periods of parental absence where dad left. And I also had my sister in my own home has, I'm 50, I'm 52 almost. My sister's 50. She has cerebral palsy with a seizure disorder and, intellectual disabilities and things. So I only share that with you because it was a unique culture to have, siblings with special needs and be in the military and parents that were in and out of the home for 3 months at a time, back and forth. And so there's all sorts of like demographic things to think about when you're working with these families. And only as I've gotten sort of more advanced in the career do I share some of that personal stuff, because I just want to keep it real with folks that this is our life's passion and our life's work. So when you're trying to think through what we know about military families. You see here the number of service members that are married. You can take a swag, roughly half. You see the number that have children, again, close to half. Thank you so much, Jason, for putting that in the chat as well. And it's a diverse group. That's one thing also that I've appreciated over the years. When you pop into a military base, you can count on it being very diverse. You can count on those communities consisting of people from rural America, from every cultural background, and all of the above. And it's also a super young population. And those of you that work on bases probably know this. Like, are you like me and always amazed when you see like someone who sort of looks right out of their teens, like walking around with 3 little ones? And you're just like, are you a mom of all 3 of those kids? It's a young population and also very resilient in many ways. Like here in the state of Indiana today, where I've just had the great fortune to talk to the American Legion about veteran suicide, and they we're talking about the dislike of the media narrative around military being broke or veterans being broken, and like how we need to change that narrative. And I 100% agree with them. It's a resilient group like none other. And it is a transient group. And I think that's gotten better over the years with the military, where they're being more thoughtful about the moves. And maybe you're not moving for moving's sake or for, this is what we do. We just move every 2 years. Instead, maybe they're moving because it's the right skill set, the right time. Maybe it's high school years are not the right time, but knowing that they're transient brings with it a whole bunch of other things when you think about our field and understanding risk and things like that. I have here some other unique aspects of military culture. And we saw during OIF and OEF, for the first time ever, a focus on repeat deployments. And there was a lot in the literature about how do we learn about periods of parental absence when either a mom or a dad continues to come and go from a family system? Like, what does that mean? Early on in the field, I will tell you, they studied family systems like from truck drivers who were coming and going on long hauls. They actually did study the Navy early on because of the Navy's emphasis on sea duty. But these war efforts were the first group where it was repeat over time, and it was the length of time also was longer than ever before. So that became part of the military culture. And I think you can see, the rest of the list here is probably self-explanatory, but the culture does have an overarching, I would say, stigma around, you're less than if you have a mental health issue. And we talked on the last call about how far the military has come with changing that stigma, but it's not there yet. Like, this is also our life's work. Like, it's okay if you're not okay. Getting mental health does not mean you're broke. Actually, it's a sign of strength. I know these are probably things everybody on this call has said quite a bit, but knowing what the tone and aspects of the culture helps us be better practitioners. Does it not? Like, it helps us sort of think through putting ourselves in the shoes of our client and do our jobs better when we know a little bit more about the culture. I want to now overlay that with what we know about military families and suicide risk. When I served in the Department of Defense over the suicide program, it was really the first time that the Congress came to us, it wasn't that long ago, and said, I want you to start collecting data on family member suicide. And there was actually quite a bit of resistance at the time because the services were like, are we allowed to do that? How will we do that? I'm not sure. If, do we collect death certificates? They're not our service members. There was just a lot of consternation around that. And of course, they got used to it, and fast forward a few years, and there was a system put in place to actually track family member suicide. One of the most interesting aspects to it for me is we know in the nation suicide is an issue, right? It's not a veteran issue. It's not a military issue. Like, it's an issue of humanity. It's like the 10th leading cause of death, second leading cause of death for young folks. So if we know that, then naturally we know it if it affects military spouses, not just females, but male spouses as well. Of course, a percentage of those that end their life by suicide will be spouses, just by the very nature of what we know about the non-military population and data. 123 people die every day by suicide in the US. And you can see here the latest data report, which captures the year 2021. I only draw your attention to that because it's like the first year post-COVID, I guess. 19 and 20 were COVID years. You see 168 total family members died by suicide. And you see here the breakdown between spouses and children and whether or not they used a firearm. It's typically with the service members close to 70% use firearm. And you can see it's a little bit lower in both of those categories for spouses and children. And you see also the number 52% were females. And you see also the ages, 69% were under the age of 18. At Columbia, we talk a lot about children and suicide, and I'm always amazed that we see reports of death by suicide by children as young as 5 years old. So it is it's not super common at that young age. It's more common in the teen years, but still it happens. And making sure we're educating military spouses on and service members on how to identify if their children are struggling and what to do about it is part of the equation. And equally so, and we probably talked about this a little bit in the last webinar, when service members are struggling with suicide risk, their spouse is usually the first to know. Usually they're living in the same house, they're starting to pick up the signs, they're starting to see it. Well, probably the same applies. If a spouse is struggling, the family system knows. So really a focus on the family is critically important. And I appreciate that the military has come so far with placing an emphasis on the family versus decades ago when you would always hear if they wanted you to have a family, they would issue you one. That's just like silliness, right? Now we know that the success of the service member is greatly correlated to the health and well-being of the family system. And the development of the children and their outcomes later is highly correlated to the health and well-being of the parents, like any family system. So here are some other stressors faced by military families. For those, have many of you also, are many of you also, if you're willing to share, a military spouse, or did you grow up in a military family as well? If anybody can put that in the chat, that would be great. Just out of curiosity. Okay, thank you, Angela. I recognize your name as well, Angela. Yes, I see. Okay, military brat. Isn't that funny? We still use that word. Former spouse. Yes. So I'm feeling a little foolish knowing how much you guys probably already know about these topics. So please chime in, correct me if this is not your experience, and also add to other topics that might educate people in that bucket when we ask that first question that we're like not all the way sure of the risks and protective factors. You see here what it must be like to live in a constant fear that you're going to get the notice about deployment, that kind of thing on your shoulder every day. And equally so, moving and being unsure, will your pay change? If we live here versus here, we were in Germany, I felt like we had a lot of money. We came back, we were in DC, I felt like we had none. The houses were good priced in Washington State, got to Maryland. The houses are very expensive. We have to live in a townhouse or an apartment now, all of those sorts of things. I want to highlight, I see I was a military kid and now I'm a spouse. So yes, it's also integrated where these kids grow up and join the military too, don't they? I want to highlight the role of employment, like employment as a stressor, specific to spouses. So you all have probably seen the research. I think it was pushed out by Rand and it's been published in many places, just about the importance of employment for military spouses and how it is a big protective factor. Well, switching and moving jobs and all that comes with that is also a stressor. I know we've come a long way with remote work and with companies that are willing to sign military spouses on and let them keep their jobs when they move. How wonderful is that? We've also come a long way with licensure where there's compact acts and you can do social work in multiple states without having to keep reapplying for your licensure. The same applies to nursing and teaching. So we have teaching. We've come a long way, but we should also never underestimate that we're still not there and there are still challenges. I know we talked on the service member discussion about pre-existing trauma and the idea that service members join the military and sometimes like victim of child abuse as a kid, or they will share extreme situations of domestic violence and sexual assault and other traumas that they experienced in their communities. The same applies to spouses. And we know that these people sometimes find each other, right? Do we not? And they sometimes help each other. And sometimes it's a struggle with each other. But pre-existing exposure to trauma before the military life also, I think, has a sort of a predictive element to how they handle future trauma and the idea of trauma on top of trauma becoming complex over time and unresolved pre-existing trauma can impact military related stressors in a way that can create bad outcomes if we're not careful. So I think the rest we've kind of hit on are fairly self-explanatory. I said we were going to talk about risk factors, and this one will look familiar to those of you that came to the last presentation. And you can see here on the slide that your big takeaway is that there are a lot of risks that could impact a situation of suicide, and there are a lot of protective factors, and balancing them is what matters. And it's not a one for one. Like, it's not like, oh, okay, they had a divorce, but they're in touch with their parents, and those relationships are strong, so things should be okay. It is all of them in a grab bag. And I see somebody said they like the slide I shared at the last one, like, please use these slides locally if they're helpful to you, and or reach me if there's any others that I can be helpful or share with you. So it is like a balance where our jobs as practitioners in this field is to have this risk dial in our head where we're like, okay, I'm meeting with this person and I know they're going through a relationship problem. I know they recently had a DUI. They went over to JAG. I know they're involved in legal. Their wife is talking about leaving them. They're going to lose their role as a dad. I know they're a cop and they probably have a gun, and like, you're just cranking up the risk dial. And then you're thinking of like, what else do they have going for them? They're still at work. They haven't been removed from their duty spot yet. And their commander is supportive. That is a big protective factor. And I went right into a military example, and I should have given a spouse one. So, I mean, think about this in the context of the spouse. The spouse has a good peer group. They have friends. They have employment that they feel valued. They have a sense of belongingness in their community. So it's like, it's a balance, and you can sort of think through where people are at in that continuum, and then how to support them. When you know somebody's risk level, you can sort of think through the best way to support them. And we'll talk more about some of the tactical support methodologies as well. But additional ways to think about risk when we're talking about children and spouses is to definitely understand their trauma history. People at risk of suicide often have attempts in their history. So check, do they have prior behavior? Even as far back, if you're meeting with a 40-year-old mom, military spouse that says, you know, I struggled in high school and I attempted suicide twice. That's good for you to know. That is prior attempt is a something to know in terms of like, would they go to that place again if the going got rough for them? Have they been in mental health treatment? I don't want your takeaway to be that military spouses that have mental health issues are the only group that's at risk, because it's just not the case. People are at risk for suicide, even if they don't have a known mental health problem, like just a life problem. And by that, I mean life problems that you or I could have, like on any given day, overwhelmed with parenting, can't feel like I feel like I can't cope that well, financial problems, legal problems, just things that don't always fall in our bucket. As a mental health person, like I'm quick to go there. And now I have to be quick to remind myself that, like, okay, these are sometimes life problems that left not dealt with over time could lead to a mental health problem. But if we were getting after them upstream, it might just be a life issue, a compilation of life issues. We talked about on the last webinar, and the same applies for spouses. And I hope maybe some of you looked up some of Thomas Joiner's work on sleep, screening for sleep. Ask your spouses when you're meeting with them, and even your children. We all know, how many of you are also parents, if you're willing to share? I have two myself, and I'm on the other side of it. They're 21 and 25, but parents and children need sleep. And we see it when kids don't have sleep, right? They just melt down and more. But I would argue that when parents aren't getting enough sleep, over time, this also impacts decision-making, coping skills, emotion regulation, just ability to be. And Thomas Joyner conducted some research that says if we didn't screen for suicide, but we screened for sleep, it would be a proxy. And I know I shared that on the last webinar, but just to hit home with folks that might not have dialed into that one, that is always one that I try to highlight, just because it's a difficult issue. I have another great colleague at the University of Washington, Jennifer Stuber. If you don't know her work, she's also one of the treasures in the field of suicide. And she shares her story from the main stage. And so I am, good to share that her husband ended his life from suicide. And he was an international attorney with so much going for him and had two small children. But one of the things that I took away from her story was just, she said, in the weeks leading up to his death, he was not sleeping. And he was doing international travel, and he was, and struggling with depression. So something to also think about when you're interacting with spouses. I think it's the interaction here of history, disrupted social networks, judgment issues, quick and easy access to lethal means. And then you mix that with these stressors, loss of a parent, problems in your relationship, problems at work. And I'm sure you guys see this play out at the installation level all the time. So I probably don't need to belabor it, but just know that it's this complex interaction effect that is what leads to terrible outcomes when we're talking about suicide. I want to dig in for a minute about children and suicide risk. How, and if any of you are willing to share, how many of you in the day appreciated learning about child development in your coursework, or have sort of a slant towards, like, we used to think of it as developmental theory, or you would hear it called like lifespan theories of life across the lifespan. I over the years have loved the developmental approach, just because it helps me think through, like, what's supposed to go on 0 to 1, what's supposed to go on between 1 to 3, what's supposed to go on between 14 to 17, and is my client in fact going through what we have studied well and know they should be going through? And if they're not, is it just because they're a little behind and that's okay? Or are they not going, are they not there because of another issue that we need to rule out or make a referral on or figure out? So I just offer, when nothing about suicide is ever, I don't want you putting that in the normal developmental appropriate or anything, but when we're assessing children for suicide risk, we should be doing it through a developmental lens. Are the problems that they're struggling with on par with where they're at developmentally? And if not, is there something that we need to do from a developmental perspective to help the family system? Maybe this is a time where kids should have a lot of friends, and they don't, so they're not interacting with a peer group, and they're struggling with suicide risk. And you put your developmental hat on and you begin to talk to mom and dad about the importance of peer groups for kids ages 12 to 14, and how they learn through peers and how they see themselves through the eyes of others of peers. And that becomes this incredible psychoed moment for you and mom and dad around, developmental lens. So But you can see here when we study the deaths by suicide of children, we see that we see a lot of bullying. And now this is even more complex with online bullying and um, social media type things. So this should be like dealt with very, very seriously. Also, we see children that have histories of child abuse. Their parents have struggled with suicide and mental health issues across the board. Eating disorders comes up, and just when we talk about suicide risk, we talk a lot about social support. It applies to kids too. Kids need social support too from people other than mom and dad, certainly coaches and teachers, but a group of their own, of peer support with their own children, with their own co-peers and things like that, critically important. And I want to also share that OneOp has published another webinar that really gets after this issue in a more in-depth way called Weaving Community Safety Nets for Youth. And if you're interested in the child side of it and you want to study this out more, I encourage you to dial in and watch that webinar, that recording, and here's the link. And I'm sure Jason will help us make sure we have it too. So there are, when we talk about suicide, we talk about thoughts and we talk about attempts, and then in tragic situations, people that end their life. And so if we were trying to get after this in a quote unquote upstream way or left of boom, like way upstream, we would try to get after it when it was just in the thought bucket, right? So ideation. So if you were trying to say, okay, what do I need to know in the thought bucket to prevent it? This would be, a short cheaters list. Subtle changes, very small, subtle changes. The problem when you're teaching this to spouses or talking to spouses about this is you really have to know people to know if there are changes. So like if me and Kaylin are in touch every day, she'll know like Kita's always like this and now she's not. So this is a small, subtle change. But knowing people is at the heart of that. And so making sure spouses know each other and communities are connected becomes part of the public health approach. But you see the rest here, and they're fairly self-explanatory. And also, I keep asking you guys these questions, I know, but and I see there's a few of you that like the human behavior developmental side. I want to ask also about prevention versus treatment. How many of you are like, that's my jam, the prevention side, early detection, upstream, you love the prevention piece of it? If you're willing to share that in the chat. Part of the importance of early detection at its most basic core is it's easier to treat, is it not? Like it's like I see a few people willing to chime in. It's easier to get after it when you're getting after a few of the symptoms versus full-blown chronic situations. And I saw that firsthand when I transitioned from my role at the DoD into the VA. And I saw vets that had struggles for 20 and 30 and 40 years from the Vietnam era that did not come in. Those were chronic cases. Well, if you apply that to your military spouse population and kids, if we know they have one or two symptoms and they're struggling and we're able to help them like woo-hoo, way upstream, we know the time that it takes to treat and get them like back into their regular sort of environments in a good, healthy way is a total win for everybody. So that explains the chronicity of the issue and protecting them from future harms. Overall outcomes, like I always mess up colloquial sayings or whatever, but an ounce of prevention, right? Help me out, somebody. But when people are able to get after prevention, it's also less costly for hospital systems and overall increases their quality of life. So I appreciate that there are other people on the call today that's their thing, because we need that in the field. We need people to understand there's a science to prevention, just as there's a science to treatment. And evidence-based practices apply to prevention too. There we go. Thank you, Kim. Like I tell you, I mess these up. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of grain, a pound of gain. So know it is true. And I have seen the data on large hospital systems that fund prevention initiatives over time, and that see a decrease in things like hospital beds, that see a decrease in number of people that need treatment over time. And they're actually able to show like this small little bit over here saves us so much on the other side. So let's jump into some practical strategies. The OneOp leadership team shared with me, like they must take away some practical strategies. So when I think about working with military families and just over the course of my career and within our field as practitioners, at its most basic level with spouses, I think a lot about how important it is to teach spouses self-awareness. Like just teaching spouses to know, to have insight and to build self-awareness. And how do we do that? Is often through, I think, motivational interviewing style questions for those of you that love MI, but teaching them how to support themselves, how to slow down and know that their palms are sweaty, so they're feeling overwhelmed, or their heart is beating faster, so they need to take a deep breath and slow down before they raise their voice to a child. Or that they're irritated and it's not the best day for them to engage with a friend. Maybe they do need a quiet day at home, but all of the skills in the self-awareness bucket, I think, matter. And the more we can just, and I know it probably sounds basic, but like teach spouses self-awareness gives them permission to own what they're going through and to be proactive in caring for themselves based on what they're going through. I don't know if others on the call have any ideas or insights around teaching people how to be insightful and slow down and own what they're going through. But if you do, certainly add those into the chat. When you're teaching them, sometimes it's also helpful to like just have them pause for a moment and think about what is their role in the family? Like what does the Franklin family believe, for example, in my own family? What do we value? If I've said it once, I probably said it like 100 times. Work hard, play hard. Like that's what we do in this family. Like I'm happy that we're able to play this hard, but we've also got to get our work done. How do we show and receive love in this family? How do we feel supported? How do I support others? I see a lot of military spouses that are very quick to support others. Maybe they're also privately struggling themselves. So that's, something to like pause and think through. What are their own triggers? And there are physical triggers, there are emotional triggers, there are behavioral triggers. Like, I don't know how many of you, like if I can't find my car keys, just know that's like a trigger. Like chances are I'm overwhelmed when I start losing my wallet or my car keys. Like that's a sign that I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I'm probably doing too much and I'm overwhelmed. I'm feeling stressed. And I see Kaylin's talking about journaling. And I think that I should have brought that up also on the last slide. Just writing out what's going on for people can just be super cathartic. People do it in different ways. Sometimes they do it with art, they do it with music, they do it with poems, but just sometimes it's just writing out what happened in your day and maybe putting a circle around what went well and a square around what didn't go well. Or, you'll see where families do high lows for the day where you kind of talk about it as a family. So we talk about self-awareness. And if anybody's like writing down gold nuggets on like something you want to visit with your team about later or a colleague at work, the next one would be self-care. Now I know I'm self-aware and now I can do all the things that you probably teach spouses already. And that, by the way, probably apply to us too, right? And you can read this list. I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but sometimes you're giving them permission. You're normalizing it in the family system that you have to fuel your body, that you have to have positive self-talk. This is like a basic part of CBT, is it not? Like, dealing with stinking thinking, or like in CBT, we would call it activity planning. When you put your sneakers by the door because you're trying to give yourself a reminder that I need to get out and walk all day. I can't sit in front of this computer all day. Or, your activity planning. You're teaching them to practice gratitude. These are all like basic components like brought out of CBT. And I appreciate that somebody put in the chat, like it applies to us too, because helping the helpers is critically important too. And I'm sure OneOp probably has other webinars, so I won't go there, but on self-care, because it is super helpful. And in the day, I always thought, oh, whatever, I'm good, whatever. But it wears on you over time. And I'm, here to tell you that, slow down now while you can and do it. So how another approach, self-awareness, and then what to do about it once you are self-aware, taking actions towards self-care. And another tactic focused on just checking in, teaching spouses how they can check in, even kids can check in, but having them check in such a way that it's beyond just like, how are you? How'd you sleep? No, like take it a step further. Based on their answer, and encourage people to not give you those quick one-word answers like fine, thanks, Encourage people to be more authentic and more vulnerable and really tell you, like, I'm not well. I feel like the allergies are bothering me. So my ear is ringing a lot throughout the day. I'm missing my college kid who went back after spring break. Like, just have people tell you what's really going on for them versus those quick, easy one-word responses. And I see Tanisa. I like that name. It's pretty, but I hope I'm saying it right, Tanisa. I find that making people understand that they can be their own best friend. Take care of yourself. Yes, find ways to love yourself. Tend to help others and give them great advice and see others' problems clearly and help them deal with it or guide them. You guys can see that comment. We can be our own best friend. That's such a good point. Just being there for yourself, Vice, constantly. And military spouses, we all on this call know, are famous for, I think, overextending themselves in the community and being there for everybody else. And so sometimes we just kind of need to give them permission. But teaching people as a reminder on how to check in, and then encouraging them not to stuff the feelings, to allow the feelings. And so what does that mean in our family? It means it's okay to cry. It means it's okay to be sad. It's not that we have to keep telling them, you're fine. You're fine. You're fine. No, there's no need to cry over that. No, if you're having a sad day, it's okay. And your feelings actually serve something. They serve a purpose, and understanding what's beneath them is helpful. Vice constantly stuffing it over time until it turns into a situation that falls on the treatment side, and where you're engaging in a situation of family violence or not good self-care, overdoing it with alcohol or other poor coping skills that we know and we have largely seen in military families and in families writ large. The other, I think, important tactical thing that families can do when you're working with military families is just encouraging them to have the hard conversation. So many families are hesitate for hard conversations, conflict adverse. That's what I wanted to say. They will avoid hard conversations like the plague. And the more we give them the skills to have them, like, and we teach them to have them at the right time and at the right place and put a time limit on it, and not to ignore it because it doesn't go away. It doesn't get better with time. I think is a teachable moment when you're working with spouses and service members alike. And when they leave, they'll be better for it. They will have built deeper connections and the relationships will be stronger because they got through that conflict. And you've seen this time and time again, probably in your own families. I know I've seen it, but also in the families that we serve. Some of us are better at listening than others, right? It is a learned skill. Those of you that have been practitioners for years, we learned this in graduate school, did we not? Like, we learned how to do active listening, right? We learned how to do reframing, like in terms of like listening in a way to be able to reframe to see if you got it right. Well, people that aren't in our field may not. And they may go right from like, okay, somebody's saying something about me, I need to get defensive and I need to respond back. Boom, boom, boom. Versus like actually teaching people the practice of listening and then sharing back, did they hear it right? What is it that the person wants? Do they want solutions or do they just want support? Teaching spouses to say, I'm just sharing, I'm not looking for you to solve it, with their service members, spouses who are like so quick to go to like solution, solution, solution. Sometimes it's just like a focus on a listening ear. So I wanted to offer these tactical skills just so that you leave the webinar with like, by no means do I think they're like Einstein level suggestions that are new. I realize that, but I just want to like bring it back to basics and give you some actionable takeaways that you could raise to the top of your toolbox and think through your work with spouses. Like, am I teaching them how to listen well? Am I modeling for them how to have hard conversations and allowing their feelings? Am I teaching them to check in at like a level 5 depth and not a level 1 depth? Am I focusing with spouses on self-care? Am I focusing with them on just like to be a little more aware on what's going on with them physically, emotionally, behaviorally, even spiritually, like what is going on with you and how do you like zone in on to your own self-awareness? So I wanted to give you those skills, and I'm going to shift a little bit towards, because this webinar is really about military spouses and screening. We talked on the last call about the Columbia, and I wanted to start our conversation this call. For those of you that don't know, you can put it also into Google, the Columbia Protocol. There's lots of ways to screen for suicide risk. The Columbia Protocol is but one way. When I was working for the Marine Corps years back and also at the Pentagon and also at the DoD, we did use the Columbia Protocol. It is part of the military healthcare system. It's part of the electronic health record. It's, it is used, but know that it's not the only way. And my best advice is to like talk to your chain of command, talk to your supervisors, and sort of adopt a methodology. There's the QPR, something like that. There's a number of them out there. Your important takeaway is to screen. If you're comfortable with this screener, great. If you're comfortable with another one and it's acceptable in your chain and in your work environment, use another one. Like there's a big debate in the field. Sometimes particularly researchers that come out of academe will like lock onto a certain camp. This is the best screener. No, this is the best screener. And I've often stayed away from those debates because I just sort of think it's academic stuff. They publish or perish, and they've got to advance their own careers in that context. And it's only my personal opinion, but my takeaway from it is always screen. Have a evidence-based, agency-approved screener and use it. That's like my big takeaway. So this is but one example. And if any of you have used it and or are open to sharing, please let me know in the chat too. It's basically a screener whereby you ask the first two, and depending on the outcome, you ask the rest. And big picture, you're asking about, do they have thoughts? You're asking about, do they have the intent to act on the thoughts? Have they done anything to prepare, like preparatory, like collected the pills, got a firearm? Because you're trying to see like how close are they to actually doing it. And then like, is this happening all the time? Are they having these thoughts all the time? Are they preparing all the time? Or in what's the recency, like within the last 3 months, or was it 3 years ago? So you're trying to assess in such a way that will then help you figure out what to do. Like, is this somebody I have to keep with me and do like a hot handoff to the ER or the MTF? Or is this like, you're having some fleeting thoughts and I need to up your supports? You're at very low risk, but the fact that you're having thoughts does still worry me. So I want to make sure that I get you into a counseling environment, or I want to provide you some of that counseling depending on your role. So seeing where they fall out in the green, healthy and well, in the yellow, in the orange, in the red, and knowing what to do about it matters. I don't want to be too repetitive by going over the screener in such a slow way because there were so many of you that were on the last one, and it is very self-explanatory. But if people have questions about the screener, how to do it, any of the above, throw them into the chat and I'm happy to crawl all over it and talk through it with you. If you've not used it a bunch, it might feel clumsy or bumpy early on. Know that that's also okay. It does not have to be perfect. Important that you ask the questions and that you're there for them. And you can even say, like, for those of you that have not done it very often, I had a colleague at SAMHSA, Richard McHugh, and if any of you know them, he says, I had one class on suicide prevention in grad school, and it was the one I taught. And so if you've not had a lot on this and you feel a little bumpy, just say, I don't do this that often, but I want to ask you. Do you want it to go to sleep and not wake up? Are you thinking of ending your leg? Just say it any way that feels comfortable, but say it is kind of like ask it is the most important part. And, your mission while you're with them and generally in your role as practitioners is to care for the person in front of you in an authentic way and to keep them safe and to know their level of risk so you can get them to the right spot. The last thing we want to do is take someone that's very, very low risk and have them sit for 6 hours in the ER. I mean, there's actually research that says like leaving the ER amps people up and can increase their risk. And equally so, someone who's high risk, we don't want to like send them home and tell their spouse, hey, make sure you keep your eye on them. Like, no, we also want to like get them into care right away. I'm sure all of you know about 988, the 3-digit number. You can even put it in your phone. Yes, the American Legion. I just met with them this morning. Be the one. Be the one. I love that campaign because I want to be the one, and I'm sure all of you as well want to like be the one. If in doubt and someone is struggling with suicide risk, I raise my hand. Like I will be the one to help them. Like make no mistake, right? And I'm sure all of you are in that same bucket. Can't emphasize enough when you're interacting with people at risk of suicide. Peer support matters for us too. So like go talk to a friend and debrief or a colleague at work, certainly with all parameters that you know of the field, like confidentiality and do it in the context of the work environment and group supervision or whatever you are calling it. But bottling that up over time too, I've seen that have not good effects with people. How many of you have heard of the Stanley Brown safety plan? This is Greg Brown and Barbara Stanley. Again, two like total incredible colleagues in the field. Barbara passed away last year and after a battle with cancer, but they were just such gold nuggets for our field in terms of their contributions. And I know there's also another webinar that goes into this one. Let me see if I can give you the name of that. Afraid to Ask, Talking with Children About Suicide. This webinar goes in more depth to the this Stanley Brown safety plan. So if you want to like sit and listen to like a very long sort of incredible training on that, I would encourage you to dial into that one. And I appreciate that Jason put it in the chat. But it in some cases, you think of it as the most basic thing, but you do it in a collaborative way, like we call it, quote unquote, like participatory way with your clients. And you just sort of work through what are their warning signs, because we know they're specific to the client, and you list them on the paper. And how do they cope? I cope by having I know when I'm overwhelmed, I always get a glass of, a cup of hot tea. It calms me down, right? So this is mine. So I would put on there, one of my coping strategies is a cup of tea. I also cope by getting out in nature, and I just love it, like taking a trail walk in the woods, not in the neighborhood, not seeing one house after the next. I like being in the woods. So like I would write that down, right? So you talk to your client and have them write down ways that they can take their mind off their problems. And then you move them right into the like, what are the people and social settings that provide distraction? By the water. I love being by the water. Anybody who knows me knows, like, so I like, that is a setting that I do well in when I'm struggling, right? So when you have people list it out, like actually list the name, like calling my sister, calling my friend, people that are helpful to them. And then you have them list out people they can access during a crisis. I always try to get them to access people that can get to them physically. I take that one, number 4, a little step further. Like I get that we're like a connected society. And like, if you're in Massachusetts, you can like call someone in, California, but I appreciate at least one of the 3 being someone that could get to them at 2 a.m, would pick up their call and could physically get to them. And then here I have, you want to ask them what professional agencies. Think back to your graduate coursework and the importance of informal supports and then formal supports. Like certainly we have formal agencies and people that get paid to help people. And that's like you or I, right? During the duty day. And then friends and their grandmother and their uncle who's very healthy, have a mix of both for number 4 and number 5. And number 6 is about protecting the environment. We talked in the last webinar about the role of firearms, and 70% of service members use firearms. We saw the data on this one. It was closer to 50 or 59% of spouses use firearms, but you've got to protect the environment. So if a spouse is not well, if a child is not well, we remove things that are lethal. And it's not because we're trying to restrict access to their firearm in a permanent way. We're just trying to put them in a safe place while they're struggling. So we want to protect their environment, whether it's medication, whether it's if they're not safe behind a vehicle, like let's not have them drive right now. I've had a girlfriend that has, phoned me and just gotten terrible news. And I've said, are you okay to drive? Like, should I come pick you up and we can get your car later? Like, this is just about like protecting the environment. Very solid evidence-based work, very well respected in the field. We implemented this again across the VA, so it's like a good to know tool. I shared with you about this OneOp webinar already. More examples when you're interacting with families and spouses that have to do with crisis. So I want to take us down the path of like a spouse or a child who popped red, high risk for suicide on the Columbia or any other screener that you choose to use. Super helpful that we still honor their self-determination and their autonomy. Because they're in crisis, it is not necessarily our time to take control away from them on their body and who they are and what their future holds. So you still do want to be collaborative. Certainly, I know that there are situations where the courts get involved and we do mandatory, committals, and that's not what I'm talking about right now. Because those are outliers. I'm talking about just generally speaking, if I were to, like, for example, protecting an environment with a spouse and there's lots of medication and I'm worried, I still ask, would it be okay if I hold on to this medicine while you're not well? Would it be okay if the medicine sits at so-and-so's house in a lockbox? I don't just take. So I'm collaborative. And I'm constantly talking about coping strategies because it's not a one and done. Like you might develop on this, Barbara, on this, Stanley Brown, you might develop 3 coping strategies and they might start using them and 2 days later, they'll come back and tell you that they're not working. And so you're right away like, okay, well, and I do it in a very like outward way. I cross it off. I'm like, okay, no longer working. Like no amount of tea is gonna help. So, and I just like kind of put a line through it and I'll, well, what else? What else can we try? Sometimes they'll have some in their bucket and other times I have to like come to the table with some just to get the creative juices going. Same thing with social supports. They will get in arguments with family members. You guys know that well, that do family work. And so I end up having to swap out and like help them think through social supports. And then I try to up their professional resources too. If they're all on base, I'll try to think through like, have you been to the Y? Like this was one of my most favorite places as a young military spouse was like to go swimming at the Y. Like I loved it. I would find one outside the gates and I would meet new, whole new community. And so I would try to think of ways to broaden their professional resources. I'm sure all of you probably fall in these buckets. You're probably part of the community resource team or part of the MTF or part of FAP. So definitely when we're talking about doing our best work, we're doing it in an interdisciplinary way. And this doesn't just apply like to family work. Know that like even in my current role, I'm spending a lot more time on technology and innovations. And I am like the best work comes from when we're bringing cross disciplines together, nursing and higher ed, social work and public health. Like when you bring all of those together to collaborate, we come up with solutions better than we ever could alone. And then of course, making referrals. The key about making referrals, I know you guys, this is your bread and butter and you know this inside now. The key about making referrals, I think over the years, what's hard about it, well, is one, finding a referral that works for them. Like how many times I've like made referrals and I'm like, I got over there and that my therapist fell asleep during the session or that MFLEC was off, they'll have all manner of sort of things. So that's why it's so important to follow up. I made a referral. Did you get there? And is it okay? Is it working? And I teach that to like commanders. I teach that to spouses and so like just ask them in a follow-up way. And it is a lot of work for you because you're constantly having to take notes. Like, okay, I gave a referral on Tuesday. I want to try to follow up by Friday and see if they made it there. Or I put them on speaker and I did the warm handoff myself, but I still have to keep like my thumb on it to make sure that they got to the second session and that it is okay because they were iffy after the first one. But the follow-up part is like, I think the hardest part of our work. So I want to ask you as part of a post-webinar check, do you feel like you know the risks and the protective factors? Like if you were trying to identify a couple, and then if you were also trying to build protective factors, would you feel like you knew those and that you could understand them? And I offer that people can like pop it into the chat or on the little poll online, and I will open it too and see. Let's see. People feeling a little more comfortable with it. Hopefully folks that had a lower one early are like, feeling at least like they know about the culture, they know about, the importance of social support and things like that. I'll give people a second. Okay, so there's still, some are still disagree that they don't feel like they could explain the risk and protective factors. Okay, this is good to know, and I appreciate the honesty on it because it is complex. It's like it's not always super intuitive or easy to know. So for those of you that Oh, you selected the wrong one. Okay, my bad. Okay. If and know that though that was okay. There is no judgment in being a little uncertain on knowing the risk and protective factors. Those of us that have been in the field, why do I rattle them off super quick? One, I'm from Massachusetts where we talk like wicked fast, but two, because I've been doing this all the time. This is like my singular thing. When you have one job, like it's your singular thing, you sort of figure it out. But if you're like all around doing lots of different things and or new to the field, um, getting a solid understanding of the risk and protective factors is not always easy. So let's take a minute and I want to like kind of go over some of them just because we have a little bit more time too. When we're talking about military, let's talk about the adults first. We know off the top of our head, trauma history, that's a risk, particularly unresolved, right? And that means family of origin stuff that could be anything. But in the trauma bucket, what we know about trauma is that it is through the eyes of the person. So like through their set of lens. So if someone says, I had a boyfriend that I was in love with and we dated for 2 weeks and we separated and it's traumatic to me, it is. Like you or I might be thinking, oh my gosh, and you were 18, but that's their lens and that's where they are right now. And we have to honor that. So we know trauma history, definitely a risk. We know engagement in alcohol abuse, right? Substance abuse issues across the board. Risk. Mental health is a risk. I'm writing them down as I'm going through them with you guys. We know that a history of, in the trauma bucket, like also a history of child abuse. How were they parented? And are there unresolved issues around that? Not having, and if they want a job and not having one, a risk. Not having a close-knit social support system that they can rely on is definitely a risk. Not having access or perceived access to healthcare. So if they believe like, oh yeah, we have mental health on this space, but I can't go because my husband won't let me. They might believe they don't have access. So not having access to healthcare. Living in rural America is a risk. Not feeling like you belong, not feeling a sense of purpose in life is a risk. All of these together, and I can even sort of go back to some of the items on the slide too, and we can kind of look at them. Let me see if I can navigate it. You'll see that the risks, it's not, one does not weigh more than the other. Like I wish we could give them a weighted value. Like, this is a level 5 and this is a level 2. It just doesn't work that way. You see here some of the risks. Having quick and easy access to something deadly like a firearm is a risk because there is a moment of impulsivity when it comes to suicide. And even there is, if any of you study resilience, and you might remember this study out of the state of Hawaii that tracked this group of people that lived on this single island in Hawaii. And Jason, even if you put it into Google, you'll pull up like Hawaiian resiliency longitudinal study. You'll see this study that really looked at genetic markers, pre-existing biological tendencies around risk. And it's not just, it's that age-old nature nurture debate. It's not one without the other, but there is some element of biology to risks. And then over on the left side, you see the protective factors. If I had to tell you one single one, it is social support across the board. Social support always tops the list of protective factors. And when people are struggling with mental illness and they have social support, they fare better. So across the board, anytime you can assess people's social support and help them build social support, that is always in the win bucket, I say. But you see the other protective factors here. I'm trying to think through ones that might not be on the list. A belief in a higher power, spirituality. It doesn't have to mean religion or going to church, but people that have a belief that when the going gets tough, I can call on a higher being and get support, like nature. Whatever it is to the person, that's a protective factor. The reason that employment, I think, is so important, and I shared on the last one, is because it does often give you purpose. It gives you belongingness. It gives you a sense of mission. It's set, like, I have to show up. Like when people aren't well and they don't show up at work, that's a first red flag where you'll see somebody says, so-and-so never misses work and they're not here today. Like that is like, boom, red flag. And employment gives you often, like I've met some of my closest friends to this day from work. that I hold so close and dear, like that I would call in an emergency in a minute, right? So it gives you fun, friendship, healthcare, hopefully, right? We have good employers that offer healthcare, belonging, mission, purpose, like 7 things in one protective factor. Which I think also speaks to the importance of all of that military spouse research that says when spouses are employed, families do better as far as like retention. And that's also probably why the military spends money on spouse employment programs, because they know that when the family's happy, the whole unit is happy. So all of that is, I think, super helpful. And for those few of you that were sort of thinking through, like, I'm still not sure what all the risk and protective factors were, does that, and if you're willing to share in the chat, does that help? Or what's the sticking point when you're thinking of your risk dial in your head of like, oh, that's a risk, that's a risk. Oh, that balances it a little, but I'm still like, kind of what's on your mind about thinking through the risk and protective factors? And I'll go back to that final question too, so we can kind of look at it together. Oop. I understand and can explain the risk and protective factors with military families. If folks have anything on that they want to put in the chat about that, I'll also remind you of some of the ones related to children. I know we talked on the slide about bullying and childhood history of abuse, and a few that we didn't hit on, I would offer for you, children that are struggling in school, academic struggles, children that feel like they don't fit in, children that feel like they have expectations on them that they can't control. In this family, we always join the military. In this family, we do this, and they feel like they might not be meeting those mandates. Over time, can carry a heavy burden on a kid. I feel for, Jennifer says, for me, I sometimes worry I'll forget something in the moment. And I have that same, I think that's very normal for us as practitioners in the field. The thing is, so many of the risks kind of hang together, and then so many of the protective hang together. So they like feed on each other, right? Like mission, purpose, belonging kind of all means the same thing, right? In a way. Substance abuse, mental health hang together. Employment and like all the things that go with employment, you'll always remember that, because you know that if someone has a job, they usually have healthcare. If someone has and a job could create them stress too, don't get me wrong. Like if especially these frontline people that are getting in jobs that get abused, like customer service type stuff, it can definitely cause them stress. So tease that out a little, but over time, I think you'll get more comfortable with thinking through the risk and protective factors, and knowing that it's our job as practitioners to try to build up the protective factors. And of course, what we don't want to do is show up to a military spouse or a kid and say, I'm here to build some protective factors. Like what? Instead you're saying, like, what do you do for fun? Like, who helps you when you're struggling the most? And they start rattling off 4 names, and I'm like writing them on a paper, and I'm like, okay, well, where does so-and-so live? Where's Jennifer? Oh, next door. I love that you have somebody that lives so close, that's so helpful, and that knows what's going on for you. Boom, 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 right? Versus they're like, we just got here. I don't know anybody yet, but not close with my mom and dad. And I knew somebody a few years ago, but I haven't called them lately. You're like high risk, like they don't have anyone in their support system. So one other thing that I'm reminded of about risk and protective factors, because I know many of you work in family advocacy, the risk and protective factors that we're talking about as it applies to suicide, they're similar for child abuse, right? They're similar for domestic violence. Like, what are the risks for, let's say, domestic violence? When people are at risk for domestic violence, they're not coping well. They might be using substance abuse. They might be, they're isolated. They don't have good social supports. The risks are the same. So like one way to think about it, same for child abuse, the risks, even for sexual assault, there's a few that hang different for sexual assault, but many of the risks are in the bell curve and are the same. So if you were doing good work at the base level, unemployment, yes, that's a risk, right? If you were doing good work at the base level to get after the risks and buff up the protective factors, and you were doing this as it applies to child abuse and domestic violence, you would be by default preventing suicide, because it's the same methods. you would be by default keeping people safe from sexual assault, give or take about 70, 80%. There's a few things with sexual assault that hang different. But having it, those of you that work in the sexual assault field, if you have a history of sexual assault, you're at increased risk of having sexual assault happen to you again, right? So it's similar. If you have a history of suicide, if you grew up in a family with domestic violence and child abuse, and you haven't learned better ways to cope, you're at increased risk of repeating those patterns. But I just say, if we were doing good work across the board in risk and protective, we would likely see reductions over time in all of these high risk areas that we're trying to get after as a community around capital P, big picture prevention. So other questions about risk and protective factors, or about children and spouses that make this work difficult for you all while you're doing it in the field every day? Let me know if things come into the chat. I know it's 12:15, so I can also go on to the next, and I think it's the last, just so I can hear from you guys on one thing that you think you could do to help a military child who are struggling with suicide risk. One thing that you think you could do. Let's see. Oh, thank you, Jason. So simple to just like be there for them. I totally agree with you, Jennifer. Like sometimes we think it's like this, I got to get in action and do all these evidence-based approaches. I've got to make sure I know how to apply CPT to teens and adolescents. And no, well, you do probably eventually, but you do need to be present and listen. Know that you can ask them the screener, the one that I shared with you or others. You can do the safety plan, the one that I shared with you, or there are others in that category too. I know Craig Bryant has one if you're interested in his work. There's others out there. Definitely, I love the idea of being authentic. And I've gotten better at that in my older age in the field. So for those of you that are newer to the field, I say be authentic, like be yourself. Listening to their story, trying to understand their own motivations. Attending to the things like firearm safety. I appreciate that, Don. Don brings up such a good point. Sometimes we can't get people to think about firearms for their own self, but they will for the kids. And so that's okay. Like, okay, if you don't want to, if you want to keep your firearm because that's your thing and it's important to you, and I respect that. Maybe will you let me keep it over here in a lockbox because we want to keep your home safe related to your child, and they will go there. You can get them that way. Loop in appropriate referrals, community support that speaks to their interest. Right. This is critically important. Another thing that I didn't bring up that you just reminded me when you had this comment about it not being a one size fit all. So many kids these days are online, and we always say we have to meet our client, right? That classic phrase in our field, meet the client where they're at. Well, what about if they're working or living or thriving or even doing school online? How do we meet their need when they're spending so much time online? And how do we teach kids to develop authentic relationships when many of their relations with others are on these online communities? That is something that we as a field I think need to think more about. Is that we need to put messages of hope in online communities, creating a safe space for them to share openly. Yes. Kids know when they can share, and they will just tell it, right? They will just tell it if they know that you're one of their own and that they can. Yep. That's such a good point, Kim. Listening to their story, honoring their story. The Veteran Pen Pal Project. I'm not familiar with that project. You'll have to show us that link or something, Rebecca. Homeschool kids engage with pen pal peers. That's interesting. I like the idea of storytelling and sharing with a friend because it brings me back to journaling. That sounds neat. I'm going to Google that one. What does it look like to engage the whole family unit in these conversations? Yeah, this is also a really good question, and something I probably should have, I appreciate Kaylin for bringing that up, because what we don't want to do is equip the service member with a whole bunch of skills and not the spouse. right? Like that will create this disequilibrium in the family. And equally so, as we empower the kids, that's terrific, but also tackling it in the context of the whole family system is critically important. And it's often a best practice to work all of it concurrently. And that's why you see, sometimes you'll see families come in together and then the dad goes and sees somebody, the mom sees somebody, and the kid sees somebody separate. But then there's also this time together. How many of you are also have a keen interest in systems theory over the years, have like appreciated the role of systems? Family being a system that can have a level of disequilibrium where when we're trying to improve the system, we have to insert coping mechanisms and problem solving skills and psychoed across the whole system, vice any one part of the system, which can almost create more disruption if you're not careful and you're not giving the whole family the tools. Equally so when we see families where we're equipping mom and dad to be in the driver's seat and we're doing all of our good work with them, but the kids don't know what's going on, I'll often ask them to bring the kids in because the parenting is going to change. The way that mom and dad approaches them is going to change. So I'll just tell them like, I know I'll work with the parents on explaining to the kids. In the past, we've done this, this, and this, and we're getting help and we're learning to do better. So in the future, we're going to do this, this, and this, and it will look different for you in this way. Do you have questions for that? Like, honor the kids and bring them into the fold around that and give them a voice at the table. Oh, so in the morning, I have to wake up 30 minutes earlier because I don't like it when mom yells at me in the morning. I start my day bad and I go to school in a bad way, but I wake up late. But this, okay, so from now on, we're going to do this and that equals this for me. Mom commits to not yelling in the morning. I'm not going to be rushed, but I have to wake up 30 minutes earlier and I still have to make my bed. And like, so I'll like help them have those conversations with the whole system so that the kids aren't seeing unexpected changes in the parents, because it is very important for the kids to see the parents as predictable. We want them to know, like, when I behave this way, I know for sure my mom will say or do this. And when I behave this way, I know for sure my mom or dad will say or do that, both in the good and bad ways. And I'm sure some of you have seen that play out even in your own parenting, I bet. Well, this has been good. I appreciate the chance to visit with everybody about this topic and your interest in it. This idea that we create healthy military communities by teaching practitioners on the ground how to engage with service members and their spouses and their kids. And obviously each and every one of you as well as key stakeholders in those communities. I feel super grateful to have this time with you today and know that I'm available for any questions and also any materials, these slides and anything else I can provide to help you do your jobs better, because I think you're at the tip of the spear and you're doing some of the most important work for these communities that you're serving.
Thank you so much, Dr. Franklin. And we do have a few minutes left for questions, so please let us know if you have any questions at all. Again, a list of the resources mentioned throughout today's session are available on the event page, as well as a few other resources that can support your work around prevention. To your point, Dr. Franklin, regarding like the systems of the military, I did have a question specifically for our providers when engaging and supporting command leaders, such as active duty soldiers or platoon or squad leaders. Do you have any suggestions for really engaging with them and what to say when it comes to leaders dealing with personnel or personnel that have family members with that suicide ideations or coming asking for help around this topic area in your vast expertise?
Yeah, it's a good question too, because I think that leaders have this tendency to think they need to focus on the troops. Rightfully so, right? Like that's what they're there for, to focus on the troops. But that type of approach where they're only focusing on the troops is like super short-sighted, not only in the context of their bottom line, which of course is readiness, but the troops are not able to be effective if a spouse or a child is struggling with suicide risk. It will shut a troop down. So sometimes when you're able to just teach them, whether it's in your initial brief that you give the command, like tell them the data on family members, tell them at your base, like if you've had a family member death by suicide, when you're doing that initial FAP brief or that initial brief with leadership, I would just run through the data with them because we know the leaders are all data driven. And I would tell them, we've had 2 spouses in the last 2 years that have died by suicide. We've had 2 teens. It's super important on this base. And what we know is it affects the troop, of course. And when we can give the troops some grace to engage with their family when their family is struggling, they come back in a super healthy way, and it's, it's better for you and they and the whole community. So I would educate them with the data, and then bring it to a place of like, they will need to tend to them. Like, what we can't have is a spouse that's struggling with suicide risk on their own, like without the support of their either wife or husband, whoever's the active duty member, particularly when they're running to lots of appointments, when they're sometimes hospitalized in extreme situations. If a kid is in inpatient care, it's a traumatic to the whole family. So educating the command on that idea that the service member will have to pause their duty requirements to tend to this. And when they do, they'll come back in a better way. I think is like super important. So that's always been my tactic, is to like, the commanders do well when they know, when they're like equipped with all the information from a data standpoint and from a how does it impact my readiness standpoint.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin, and for providing all this data across both sessions that can be utilized in that work as well. And thank you all so much for joining us for this powerful session by Dr. Franklin, and appreciate all of the input as well in the chat pod. So for those who have stayed tuned till the end, I will be covering continuing education credit information. The link to this evaluation is available on the event page. When you visit the page, you will see a purple button like the one on the screen. Click that and it will take you to first the evaluation and then a post test, which is the process you will need to complete for a CE application. If you do not see this button, and especially if you have had the page pulled up since the beginning of the webinar, please refresh or exit out and reload the page, as that is populated during the session. So if you've had our page pulled up since the beginning, you're not going to see it. So again, please refresh. Your feedback is very important to us, as we've shared with Dr. Franklin as well, and she incorporated throughout this session. So we do ask our audience to take a short evaluation, letting us know your thoughts on today's webinar. And then from there, those wanting to obtain CE credits, after you complete the evaluation, you will be directed to a list of the opportunities for today's session. Continuing education credits are available from the American Association of Family and Consumer Sciences, the DoD Sexual Assault Advocate Certification Program, the University of Texas at Austin Steve Hicks School of Social Work for our social workers, and LMFTs, the Commission for Case Manager Certification, the National Advocate Credentialing Program for DAVAs, the National Council on Family Relations for our Certified Family Life Educators, the Patient Advocate Certification Board, and a certificate of attendance are available for anyone who is not captured in that list and would like to document your professional development hour activities. Some of these certificates require that post test that I mentioned, some do not. So if you do have to do that post test, once you have completed that with an 80% or higher success rate, your certificate will be emailed to you within 24 to 48 hours of completing that process. Some email providers will direct that to your spam folder, so please be sure to check there first, especially if you have not received a certificate from us before. If you still have not received your certificate after doing the process within a day or so, again, please check your spam folder. But if you have not received that, please email us at ce@oneop.org. That is listed on the slides as well for reference. If you have any issues, just refer back to this slide 49, and you will see our email there. So please just email us and we will make sure that you get your certificate of choice for joining us for today's session.